He held the letter in his pocket for the rest of his life. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the most powerful military commander on Earth, carried a single crumpled note that began with the words, "Our landings have failed." He had written it himself, by hand, days before the invasion. It was his confession, his resignation, his admission that the largest amphibious assault in human history had been swept back into the sea. He never had to read it aloud, but he was prepared to. While history tells us the Normandy landings succeeded and opened the road to Berlin, Eisenhower genuinely believed they might not. The contingency was real, the letter was real, and the German defenses were strong enough that the outcome hung on a knife's edge for hours. So based on the actual strategic plans, the real industrial capacities, and the documented fears of the men who held the fate of the world in their hands, this is exactly what would have unfolded if the Beaches had won, and the invasion had collapsed on the morning of June 6, 1944. Picture a small broadcast room in southern England on the morning of June 7th. The air is stale with cigarette smoke and exhaustion. Eisenhower has not slept. His hands, usually steady, tremble slightly as he reaches into his jacket and pulls out that folded scrap of paper. Outside, across the channel, the truth is already undeniable. Landing craft that had carried young men toward Omaha and Utah only a day earlier are now reversing engines, churning the grey water white, pulling back toward England with their decks nearly empty. Thousands of soldiers remain behind on the sand, stranded, captured, or fallen. The Great Wall of German fire never broke. The beach exits stayed sealed, and the tide, indifferent to ambition, simply rolled back in. When Eisenhower speaks into the microphone, his voice is flat. He takes full blame. He tells the free world that the assault on Fortress Europe has been repulsed, that the troops fought with extraordinary courage, and that the responsibility for the failure is his alone. In London, in Washington, in occupied Paris where resistance fighters had been waiting for a signal, the words land like a physical blow. The myth of Allied invincibility, so carefully constructed, shatters in a single broadcast. For 3 years, the free peoples of the world had been promised that the liberation would come from the West. Now the West had tried, and the West had been thrown back. And here is the first moment that makes you stop and think. The failure was not really about courage, or even numbers. It came down to a few hours of confusion, a handful of beach exits, and the brutal mathematics of men advancing uphill into prepared positions. The margin between victory and catastrophe at Normandy was always razor-thin. The same operation, tilted just slightly, produces an entirely different century. The immediate consequence is not military. It is human, and it happens at the very top. A commander who presides over a defeat of this magnitude cannot remain. Eisenhower resigns, and the moment he steps down, the carefully balanced machinery of the unified Allied command begins to tear itself apart. For years, the Americans and the British had argued, sometimes bitterly, about how and when to invade. Now, with the Beaches lost, and a generation of young men gone or captured, those old arguments curdle into open accusation. Washington blames London for insisting on delays. London blames Washington for rushing an operation that was not ready. The combined chiefs of staff, once a model of cooperation, dissolve into recrimination. Into this wreckage steps a familiar figure, General George S. Patton, the most aggressive armored commander the Americans possessed, the man who had been kept in reserve as the fictional leader of a phantom army, designed to deceive the Germans about the true invasion site. In the world where D-Day succeeded, Patton would soon be unleashed to race across France in one of the great mechanized drives of the war. But in this world, there is no France to race across. There is only a defeated, demoralized army huddled back in England, and Patton is brought forward not to attack, but to rebuild shattered morale. The cavalryman who dreamed of bold breakthroughs is reduced to walking among exhausted survivors, trying to convince men who had watched the Atlantic Wall hold that it could ever be broken again. It is the cruelest possible assignment for a man built for the offensive. Now cross the channel and step into the other side of the war, because the story of what happens next can only be understood through the eyes of the enemy. In Berlin, the mood is electric. In the great map rooms of the German High Command, Officers who had spent years bracing for the Western invasion are suddenly intoxicated with relief and triumph. They had stopped the Americans and the British at the waterline. They had done what they always insisted they could do. The talk in the corridors is openly contemptuous. The Allies, they sneer, were amateurs who believed they could simply storm a fortified continent and walk to Paris. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had long doubted the enemy's resolve, now feels vindicated. The Atlantic Wall, so often mocked as propaganda concrete, had proven to be exactly what the Führer promised. And this triumph immediately produces a strategic windfall that should make any student of the war sit up. The German 15th Army, a powerful force of fresh divisions, had been held back near the Pas-de-Calais for weeks, frozen in place by an elaborate Allied deception that convinced Berlin the real invasion would come there. In the true history, those divisions waited too long, and the deception worked just long enough for the beachhead to grow strong. But in this version, with the Normandy landings already crushed, that entire deception collapses overnight. The Germans realize there will be no second landing at Calais. The Phantom Army was a bluff, and the bluff has been called. Dozens of rested, fully equipped divisions are suddenly free, and they pour westward to permanently seal every possible invasion beach from the Netherlands to Brittany. Field Marshal Rommel's long-held dream of stopping the enemy at the water's edge becomes permanent doctrine. German officers begin to boast, in letters home and in staff meetings, that Fortress Europe will now stand for 1,000 years. That confidence has a darker consequence, and this is where the nightmare truly begins to accelerate. Free from the fear of an Allied ground campaign tearing across northern France, the Germans turn their industrial genius toward the weapons that had always terrified them most. The vengeance weapons. The launch sites for the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets had, in reality, been overrun within months by advancing Allied troops. But here, no troops are coming. The coast of France remains firmly in German hands, and along that coast, the engineers build without interruption. Hardened bunkers, concrete launch ramps, underground assembly works carved into hillsides. Thousands of sites, sprawling across the occupied territory, all pointed at one target. For the people of London and southern England, the result is a slow descent into a kind of terror that has no front line and no safe hour. The V-1 arrives with a stuttering mechanical growl, and the British learn to dread not the sound, but the silence that follows when the engine cuts out and the bomb begins to fall. The V-2 is worse because it arrives faster than sound itself, striking without any warning at all. There is no air raid siren that can outrun a rocket falling from the edge of space. Night after night, week after week, the explosions march across the city. The British people, who had endured the Blitz with legendary stubbornness, now face something the Blitz never was: endless, unanswerable, unstoppable. And for the first time in the war, serious voices in Britain begin, quietly, to wonder how much more the island can take. Hitler, watching the Western Allies reel, senses an opportunity that he seizes with ruthless speed. For years, the war at sea had turned against Germany. The U-boat fleet, once the terror of the Atlantic, had been beaten back by convoy tactics, long-range aircraft, and code-breaking. Funding had drained away from the Navy and toward coastal defense. But now the coast is secure, and Hitler reverses the flow of resources overnight, pouring steel and labor back into the one weapon that could strangle Britain and isolate America: the new Type 21 submarine. And this is where you have to pause again, because the Type 21 was genuinely a generation ahead of anything else in the water. It could remain submerged for days, run faster underwater than on the surface, and dive deeper than its hunters could follow. In the real war, only a handful ever reached the front before Germany's collapse, and they arrived far too late to matter. But in this world, with the coast secure and the Navy's funding restored, they arrive on time, and they arrive in numbers. The wolf packs return to the Atlantic, only now they are nearly invisible and nearly untouchable. The supply line between America and Britain, the single artery that kept the war in Europe alive, begins to bleed. Convoys that once crossed in relative safety again vanish into the grey. The Battle of the Atlantic, thought won, reopens with a ferocity that threatens to cut the free world in two. For the American public, this is the breaking point. They had been told the war in Europe was the priority, that Germany must be defeated first. They had sent their sons across the ocean on a promise. Now those sons are gone, or imprisoned behind the Atlantic Wall. The ships carrying their replacements are being destroyed at sea, and the enemy seems stronger than ever. The mood in the United States curdles from grief into fury, and then into a hard, practical question. Why are we dying in the Atlantic for a continent we cannot reach, when there is an enemy in the Pacific we are actually beating? The pressure becomes irresistible, and the grand strategy that had governed the entire war, the doctrine that Europe must come first, simply collapses. The factories of America, the new ships, the fresh divisions, the mountains of supplies, all begin to flow west instead of east. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz, who had fought the entire war as the underfunded theater, suddenly find resources arriving in volumes they had only dreamed of. The island-hopping campaign accelerates, and across the ocean, Britain is left almost entirely alone, a battered island facing a confident, fortified, victorious empire just across a narrow strip of water, with its great ally turning its back to fight a different war. But the Allies are not finished, and what they do next transforms the war into something almost apocalyptic. If they cannot fight the Germans on the ground, if there is no beachhead, no front, no army marching toward Berlin, then they will fight them in the only place left, the sky. The combined bomber forces of the American Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force, denied any other path to victory, throw everything into a campaign of strategic bombing on a scale the world has never imagined. Around the clock. The British by night, the Americans by day. Wave after wave of B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted now by long-range fighters, droning over Germany in numbers that blacken the sky. And here, at last, the German story turns. Remember those Luftwaffe pilots who had laughed at the retreating Americans, who had toasted their victory over the amateurs at the beaches? Now they climb into their cockpits day after day to face an enemy that never stops coming. The hubris drains away first into disbelief, then into something colder. A fighter pilot who scrambles to intercept a raid sees not a formation, but a horizon filled edge to edge with aircraft. The factories he has sworn to protect vanish under the bombing. The oil refineries that feed his engines burn. The railways that move his fuel and parts are severed again and again. German aircraft production strains and then begins to falter, not for lack of will, but for lack of fuel and steel and intact factories to build in. The moment of disbelief becomes a moment of terror. German officers, in their letters and their war diaries, begin to describe a war they cannot win in the air, an enemy whose industrial output seems to have no ceiling. The cities they had been promised were safe shudder under the relentless campaign. The same high command that boasted Fortress Europe would stand for 1,000 years now confronts a brutal truth. They had won the beaches and lost the sky, and the sky, it turns out, has no wall. They had pushed the Allies off the continent only to discover that the Allies could reach them anyway, from above, without ever setting foot on French soil. Yet even this is not the deepest irony of the story, because while Germany congratulates itself on holding the West, the true reckoning is gathering in the East. In Moscow, Stalin watches the collapse of the Western Front with a cold, calculating eye. He had demanded a second front for years, had accused his allies of letting the Soviet Union bleed while they waited. Now the second front has been tried, and it has failed, and Stalin understands instantly what it means. He will face the full weight of the German army, almost alone. The Eastern Front, already the largest and most ruthless land war in human history, becomes something beyond imagining. Without a Western invasion to divide German strength, the divisions that would have rushed to Normandy instead reinforce the East, and the two great land armies of the war grind against each other in a contest of pure attrition and industrial endurance. But here is the thing the Germans never understood about the Red Army. It did not break. It absorbed catastrophic losses, and then it produced more men, more tanks, more artillery, and it kept coming. Soviet factories, relocated far beyond the Ural Mountains, poured out weapons in numbers that simply could not be matched. The Red Army, hardened by years of brutal fighting, mutated into an unstoppable engine driven by a single, burning purpose: to reach Berlin, and then to keep going. And it does keep going. Slowly, inevitably, the front rolls west. The German offensives stall, and then reverse. Division after division is destroyed and not replaced. The Wehrmacht that had felt invincible on the beaches of Normandy now finds itself ground down on the endless eastern plains, retreating across the very countries it had conquered, with no second front to relieve the pressure, no two-front dilemma to exploit, only the remorseless westward tide of Soviet power. This is the moment that forces the most chilling decision of the entire war, and it happens far from any battlefield, in the laboratories and test sites of the American desert. The Manhattan Project, the secret race to build an atomic weapon, had always assumed its target would be Japan. But with no Allied army on the ground in Europe, with Germany still defiant behind its fortified wall, with the Soviets advancing but the Western powers unable to land a single division, the strategic logic shifts in a way that few had ever dared to contemplate. The first atomic weapon, the most destructive device ever created, is no longer earmarked for the Pacific. It is reassigned to a target in Europe, perhaps Berlin itself, perhaps the great concrete U-boat pens that shelter the submarines strangling the Atlantic, structures so heavily armored that conventional bombs simply bounce off them. Imagine the planners standing over the maps, weighing a decision no human being should ever have to make, choosing between unleashing the ultimate weapon on a European city or standing aside and watching the Soviet Union win the war on its own terms. Because that, in the end, is the real choice, and it leads directly to the final, devastating irony, the consequence that the celebrating officers in Berlin never saw coming on that triumphant morning in June. By winning at Normandy, Germany sealed its own destruction. By pushing the Americans and the British into the sea, they removed the only force that could have met the Soviet Union halfway across Europe. They ensured that when Germany finally fell, and fall it would fall entirely to the east. There would be no American troops liberating Paris, no British and Canadian armies sweeping through the Low Countries, no Western line drawn through the middle of Germany. Instead, the Red Army, that unstoppable engine of vengeance, would grind its way across the whole of the continent, through Poland, through Germany, through France itself, all the way to the shores of the English Channel. And so the war in Europe ends not with a handshake between East and West in the heart of Germany, but with Soviet soldiers standing on the beaches of Normandy, looking out across the same water that had swallowed the Allied invasion. The Iron Curtain does not fall through the center of Europe. It falls at the edge of the sea. From the cliffs of Dover, American and British observers would stare across that narrow, grey strip of water at a continent entirely under Soviet control, a single power dominating everything from Moscow to the Atlantic coast. The Cold War would not begin in a divided Berlin. It would begin at the water's edge, with the free world clinging to one battered island, watching a unified, victorious Soviet Europe stare back. Which brings us back to that small, smoke-filled broadcast room, and the trembling hand reaching for a folded scrap of paper. Eisenhower had written that letter, believing it might end his career and stain his name forever. He never imagined how much more than a career was riding on those few hours of fire and confusion on the sand. The men who held those beaches for Germany thought they had saved their nation. They had, in fact, doomed it and reshaped the world for a century to come. History so often turns not on grand designs, but on a single morning, a few exits in a wall of concrete, and the courage or exhaustion of ordinary men. The invasion succeeded, and because it did, the world we know exists. But it came so close to the other story, the one written in that letter Eisenhower carried in his pocket for the rest of his life, that we should never again call it inevitable. It was, from first to last, a near thing, and the entire shape of the modern world balanced, for a few short hours, on the edge of the sea.